Okay, this is going to be the removal and the reinstallation as well as the inspection and the cleaning of a throttle body. First step in any procedure is always to make sure we wear eye protection. And the first part that we want to go ahead and get out of our way is our throttle cable bracket and our throttle cables that are attached to the throttle pedal. Now notice we have two cables. One of these cables runs inside the car and goes to our throttle pedal, our gas pedal. The other one runs over to our cruise control module, which is what would control the speed of the vehicle when we're under the cruise setting. So we'll go ahead and we'll remove the two bolts on top that hold our cruise control bracket in place. I'm sorry, our throttle and cruise control brackets. We'll set our bolts off to the side, and we can remove the cruise control bracket, or we can remove the cruise control cable, I should say, by pushing down and unlatching it. And the throttle cable, what we want to do is actually open the throttle. Our cable will wrap around, and then we can unhook it from our throttle arm. Once our cables are out of the way, we can lift our bracket off to the side. And we'll set that bracket off to the side. We now have some electrical connections that we want to disconnect. The first connector that we want to disconnect is our mass airflow sensor. Now we've been talking about the mass airflow sensor, measuring the mass of the air coming into the engine. That's plugged into the computer through this wire, so we'll go ahead and we'll unplug that. Also in that same electrical harness, we have a plug for our intake air temperature sensor. The temperature of the air coming into the engine is measured through the sensor, so we'll go ahead and we'll pull back. Now we don't want to bend these connectors back so far that we break them, but we just want to pull back far enough to release them and unplug them. If you need help with this step, just make sure to ask for help. We're going to turn the sensor so I have a little bit more room to lift up on the tab and pull the plug out. On the other side of my throttle body, I have a plug for my idle air control motor. We'll talk about that when we discuss idle controls. Same thing, we'll pull back on that tab and disconnect that connector. That should allow us to pull most of our electrical harness out of the way. At that point, we can go ahead and we can remove our air box and our air intake tube from our engine. This will give us a little bit more room to work with. So we're just going to pull the tube back off. There would normally be a clamp around this. That clamp is missing. And we'll pull that tube right out of the way. And I'm also going to go ahead to give myself even a little bit more room. I'm going to remove my air intake box. Behind that air intake box, you'll see we have our air filter as well. We'll go ahead and get that out of the way. We talked about air filters when we discussed the service procedures on vehicles and checking fluids. We now have a clear shot at our throttle body, and the last electrical connection that we're going to remove is our throttle position sensor, which is on the back side of the throttle body, and that will get our harness completely out of our way. So we'll go ahead and remove these two bolts. It's actually a bolt on top, and it's a stud with a nut on the bottom. And we may need an extension to get in underneath. And we can remove our throttle body from the engine. Let's take a little closer look. So this is our throttle body. Now you'll notice we have the arm, which is connected to our throttle valve. This is our throttle valve inside. When we step on the gas pedal, that valve opens, and as that valve opens, it allows more air to flow into the engine. Remember, more air going into the engine means we can burn more fuel, and therefore we produce more power from the engine. We learned about this in the intro class when we talked about carburetors. So in an electronic fuel-injected engine like this one, we still control the air coming into the engine the same way using a throttle valve. And again, as that throttle opens, more air. So this would be idle right now, and this would be wide open throttle. Now when this throttle valve is closed, the engine will still continue to run. We call that idle. So we start the engine, we're not stepping on the gas pedal, that's idle time. At that point, there is very, very minimal air that's coming in around this throttle valve. The air that's coming into the engine is being controlled through this valve on the side of our throttle body, which is called the idle air control motor. This idle air control motor is what we call a stepper motor, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about idle controls. This idle air control motor controls the amount of air coming in and therefore regulates the idle. Well, why is that important? Let's say we start our car and we're just sitting there with the engine idling, no AC on, no accessories running. The engine's going to be at whatever that certain idle happens to be. Whatever the manufacturer has specified as the idle, it will be maintained by this idle air control motor. If we didn't have an idle air control motor, when we decided to do something like, let's say, turn on the air conditioning, our engine would want to stall because that extra load, or let's say we turn the steering wheel while we were sitting there, that extra load on the engine would actually stall out the engine. The idle air control motor compensates for that by letting additional air in. You'll also notice that there is another sensor on the side. This is our throttle position sensor. When we talk about engine controls, we'll talk more about the throttle position sensor. But this sends important information back to the car's computer to tell the computer what position the throttle's in. It's important that the computer knows what the driver's doing as far as stepping on the gas. Now, this throttle body can cause problems if it gets a buildup of carbon inside it. Well, look, this is the side that faces the engine, and you'll notice this kind of black sootiness inside here. That is carbon. That carbon buildup comes from the burning of fuel in the engine. Remember that we're burning fuel in the combustion chamber, but when our intake valve opens, there's still some leftover gases and carbon left behind that can work its way back up through the intake manifold, and we call that reversion when that takes place. In addition, we have the intake valve closing at the end of our intake stroke, which pushes some of those things back. So we get that carbon buildup around our throttle valve. If that carbon buildup gets heavy enough, it can interfere with the airflow into the engine and therefore create idle issues. So to clean that throttle body, what we're going to do is we're going to take a small amount of carburetor or brake cleaner. We're going to put it on a rag. Notice I'm wearing gloves for this because these chemicals are a little bit harsh on your hands. And I'm just going to take and wipe that area out around the throttle valve. Now theoretically this could be done with the throttle valve, with the throttle body on the car, but it's much more effective to take it off the car and do this cleaning process. So we'll clean this area around the throttle valve the best that we can. Removing as much of the carbon as possible, especially on the back side of that valve. Now the most important area is where the valve meets the throttle valve, the throttle body. That's where we can end up with a blockage of that airflow. So we want to get that as clean as possible and get as much of the carbon out of there as possible so that our throttle valve can allow the proper amount of air to flow through it and our idle air control motor can function properly in terms of controlling the airflow into the engine. Once we do that, we're ready to reinstall our throttle body onto our engine. I just want to note before we reinstall the throttle body that we do have an opening to our engine, so we want to make sure nothing gets inside of there. Okay, that opening is into our intake plenum. Remember, we talked about the plenum being the common area of the intake manifold, which then spreads out to our individual runners that go out to each of the 6 cylinders of this engine. So we're going to reverse the process of disassembly in order to reinstall our throttle body, starting with our bottom bolt, and then our top bolt. And we'll tighten them both up. And we're now ready to reconnect some of our electrical connectors, including our throttle position sensor, which is this 3-wire plug. Also, our idle air control motor, which is a 4-wire plug. These plugs are different, so you can't mix them up. And we'll go ahead and place our air intake tube back on to our throttle body. Now I want to note there should be a clamp here, but since we're using this for educational purposes, the clamps are not in place. We need to replace those at some point. And this could actually create a potential problem for this vehicle. The reason being, if air gets in around this tube that we're not measuring with that mass airflow sensor, the computer is not going to be aware that that air is coming in, and therefore it's not going to mix the proper amount of fuel. So it is actually very important that this is clamped and forms a good seal on this style of engine, which is what we call a mass airflow style engine. So we'll go ahead and we will install the air cleaner cover, and that portion of the air intake tube. You know, I think I'm going to backtrack a little bit here. I think I'm going to take this tube back off and I'm going to put it onto my mass airflow sensor first. It's a little bit of a tight fit to get everything to go in place the way it should. And that should allow me and we'll lock our air cover in place. As you can see, this is a little bit of a struggle to get everything to line up as it should, but with a little bit of effort you can get things back where they need to be. And we'll go ahead and we will plug in our intake air temperature sensor and our mass airflow sensor. Lastly, we're ready to reconnect our throttle cable as well as our cruise control cable. There is a bracket that goes down underneath. So we'll start with our throttle cable. Again, to do that, we need to open our throttle all the way, slide the barrel of our cable into place. I know this is a little hard to see on the camera. And that locks our throttle in place. And then we can hook our cruise control as well. And we'll reinstall our bolts for our throttle cable bracket. And we'll tighten those bolts. So that completes the removal, the cleaning, and the reinstallation of our throttle body. Remember, our throttle body is what controls the amount of air going into the engine, and therefore the speed of the engine once that air is mixed with fuel. I also want to note, after a procedure like this, that we might find that when we first start the vehicle, the engine may run a little rough initially. The reason for that is, remember, that idle air control motor is compensating for the low or high idle of the vehicle. Over time, the computer, the electronic control unit, the engine control unit, learns what the needed idle air control motor position is. And when we clean the throttle body, although we're actually helping airflow, it takes a little bit of time for that idle air control motor to now correct for that. This may be even more true in a drive-by-wire vehicle. This happens to be a drive-by cable vehicle. Many of our newer vehicles on the road today are drive-by-wire vehicles, and in a drive-by-wire vehicle, there is no idle air control motor. Our idle is controlled by that throttle blade, which is really controlled by the car's computer. And when we clean the throttle body, we throw off the position of that throttle valve, and it does take some time for the computer to relearn or compensate for that. Thank you everybody for watching. Have a great day.